The gaslight hissed with a serpentine persistence that filled the record room more completely than any human voice could hope to achieve, drowning the silence in a low, chemical burn. Dust motes danced within the yellow jet above the mahogany desk, swirling in the thermal rise like ash drifting from a fire extinguished hours prior, settling slowly upon the wood, where decades of clerks had scratched their quills into the grain until the surface bore the scars of administration. Elias Thorne stood before the surface, his palms resting flat against the timber as if testing for a pulse, while the air smelled of rusting iron shelves and the sour tang of old glue, a scent that clung to the back of the throat like a promise of consumption. He did not look up when the door opened, for to acknowledge the intrusion would be to invite the chaos of the corridor into this sanctuary of dust. "Box for the senior clerk." The messenger's voice was rough, scraped raw by coal smoke and cheap tobacco, carrying the grit of the streets into the sterile quiet. Thorne kept his eyes on the dust, knowing that to acknowledge the man would be to acknowledge the reason the box existed, a tangible weight of official sorrow. "Leave it on the table," he murmured, though the messenger insisted upon a signature, citing protocol with the stubbornness of a man who knew rules were the only armor he possessed. Thorne exhaled, a slow release of breath that did nothing to cool the sweltering heat of the room, which pressed against them like a physical blanket. He reached for the pen without turning, finding the inkwell dry, yet dipping the nib into the pot anyway to scratch a meaningless mark on the ledger before pushing it back across the wood. The messenger took the book, his boots scuffing on the stone floor with heavy, deliberate steps that echoed the ticking of a clock, before a wooden box thudded onto the desk, displacing a stack of routine warrants and causing Thorne to flinch at the sudden violence of the impact. "Who sent it?" "Home Secretary's office, direct." The door clicked shut, and the locks engaged with a finality that left Thorne alone with the dead man's effects, the silence rushing back in to fill the space where the messenger had stood. He looked down at the box, constructed of pine, unvarnished and rough to the touch, where a seal of red wax held the lid fast, stamped with the crest of the Home Office in blood-bright color. His fingers trembled slightly as he reached for the letter opener, the steel feeling unnaturally cold against his palm, a shock against the humid air that smelled of rain and soot. He pressed the blade into the wax until the seal snapped with a sharp crack that might have been a discharge in the silent room, yet he waited for the echo to fade, only to find it was swallowed immediately by the thick walls, leaving no trace of the violation. Thorne lifted the lid to reveal a bundle of letters tied with black ribbon, damp from the July rain that still clung to the wool of his coat, for he recognized the dampness, having walked through the same downpour on his way from Whitehall to the office this morning. The moisture had seeped into the wood, giving the contents a slight warp, and when he reached in his fingers, was stained with indigo ink, permanent marks of his trade that no amount of scrubbing could remove. He touched the top letter, and the ink from his fingertips smudged the crisp white paper, leaving a blue bruise on the corner that served as a visual record of his intrusion, a stain upon the integrity of the dead. He should not be doing this, for the warrant specified only the official correspondence regarding the Penal Servitude Act, while private letters were to be sealed and returned to the family according to the regulation he knew intimately, having written the memo himself last year. Yet his hands continued to move, methodical and precise, a defense against the chaos of the news outside, where the papers were screaming of a tidal wave of violence, claiming the streets were no longer safe for a gentleman after dusk, and that the ticket-of-leave men were hunting in packs. Thorne knew the streets because he walked them every day, seeing only the ordinary weariness of the city's workers and the hunched shoulders of men carrying loads too heavy for their frames, rather than the monsters depicted in the Times. He lifted the bundle, finding it heavier than it looked, the ribbon tied in a tight knot that was difficult to undo with stiff fingers, so he worked at it with his thumbnail, feeling the fibers resist before finally giving way. The letters spilled out onto the desk, a cascade of cream and blue paper, and he began to sort them into bills and invitations, including a note from his tailor regarding a fitting for a new frock coat, all mundane things that spoke of the life of a man who expected to have a future. Thorne picked up the top letter, the envelope plain and unsealed, and slid the paper out with a care reserved for holy relics. The handwriting was distinct, featuring looped capitals and a sharp downward stroke on the Y that he had seen before on the minutes from the Manchester Constabulary, recognizing it immediately as Pilkington's own hand. Thorne's breathing shallowed as the gaslight flickered, casting long, uncertain shadows that stretched across the floorboards like grasping fingers seeking purchase on the smooth wood. He brought the paper closer to the light, noting the ink was dark and fresh, dated the morning of the attack, 17 July, which was 2 days ago, and the day Pilkington was garroted near Parliament Square. Thorne traced the grain of the mahogany desk with his fingernail, a compulsive tick that signaled his rising anxiety as he sought a pattern in the wood that did not exist, while the paper smelled of stale tobacco and the metallic tang of ink that stains the conscience as deeply as the skin. He began to read. "My dear George, the figures provided do not align with the reports from the local constabulary. I cannot sign the act based on inflated returns. There is no spike in violence. None." Thorne stopped as the words blurred in the heat, and the temperature of the room pressed against his temples like a vice. He looked at the ledger on the shelf behind him, the official record of assaults in London for July, which he had copied himself yesterday to show a spike, a significant one enough to justify the panic and the act. He turned back to the letter where Pilkington's handwriting did not waver, showing no fear in the script, only a mundane concern regarding the Tiketov leave system that contradicted the official narrative. A noise from the corridor interrupted his reverie, a heavy tread on stone that stopped abruptly outside the record room door, causing Thorne to freeze while the letter lay half-hidden beneath a stack of routine warrants. He did not breathe as the silence stretched, brittle as glass, before he resumed his sorting with exaggerated slowness, forcing his hands to remain steady despite the urge to snatch the letter and conceal it within his frock coat. The boots moved away eventually, the sound fading into the hum of the building, leaving Thorne with the certainty that he had been marked, a target in a room that offered no escape. He folded the letter slowly, creasing the paper with precise, deliberate pressure, as if trying to imprint the truth onto his memory before the walls closed in completely. The words on the page did not tremble, though Thorne's hand had begun to shake with a fine, electric palsy that traveled up the radius to the elbow. None, a single emphatic negation, underlined twice in ink that had not yet lost its sheen, sat in stark opposition to the red-inked columns of the official ledger standing sentinel on the shelf behind him. He turned from the desk, the chair legs scraping against the flagstones with a shriek that sounded too loud in the suffocating quiet of the room, and retrieved the heavy-bound volume of returns for July. The leather cover was cool, slick with the humidity that clung to every surface in Whitehall, smelling of tanning salts and the dust of 1,000 untouched pages. He laid the book open beside Pilkington's note, the juxtaposition absurd. The private, hurried script of a dead man arguing for peace against the rigid, printed typography of state-sanctioned panic. There it was, page 42. Assaults with intent to rob, 14. Garrottings, 6. Total violent incidents in the Metropolitan Police District, a sharp, jagged climb that doubled the figures from June. Thorne traced the column with a finger stained blue, following the dates down to the 17th, the day of the attack, where the numbers spiked as if struck by lightning. Yet Pilkington's letter spoke of Manchester, yes, but it referenced the London returns he had received on the 15th, 2 days prior to his death, which showed a decline. A decline. Thorne's breath hitched, a dry catch in the throat that tasted of copper and old fear. He looked closer at the ledger, squinting until the gaslight fractured into halos around the numerals. The entry for the 17th had been added in a different hand, the ink slightly darker, the pen pressure heavier, lacking the consistent, looping flourish of the junior clerk who usually maintained the log. It was an insertion, a graft upon the living tree of the record, done hastily to make the branches bear the fruit required by the season. He leaned back, the wood of the chair groaning under his shift in weight, and wiped his upper lip with the back of his hand, coming away with a smear of sweat that felt cold against the sweltering air. This was not error. Mistake was a creature of negligence, a sloppy sum or a misplaced decimal, but this was architecture. Someone had built a wall of numbers to block out the sun, constructing a fortress of lies so high that no one would think to look over the top to see the quiet fields beyond. The panic in the streets, the extra editions screaming of blood in the gutters, the demands for the Penal Servitude Act to be rushed through Parliament with all hastier, it was not a reaction. It was a performance. The audience was the public, terrified and blind, and the stage was set with props of paper and ink that cost nothing to manufacture but everything to believe. Thorne reached for the ledger again, needing to touch the lie, to feel the texture of the deception under his fingertips, but a sound from the corridor arrested the motion before his skin could make contact. Boots, heavy, deliberate steps on the stone flagging outside, moving with a rhythm that suggested purpose rather than passage. They stopped, directly opposite the door. The silence that rushed into the vacuum left by the cessation of movement was thick, pressing against the thin wood of the doorframe like a physical weight. Thorne froze, his hand hovering over the open book, the letter from Pilkington half buried beneath a stack of mundane warrants regarding horse theft and vagrancy. He did not breathe. He dared not even blink, fearing the click of his eyelids might betray him to the listener on the other side. The gas jet above his head hissed, a serpentine sound that seemed to mock his stillness, and the flame flickered, casting long, distorted shadows that stretched across the floorboards like grasping fingers seeking a hold. He thought of the laborer, the innocent man from Bermondsey, whose warrant he had signed 3 years ago based on a similar surge in the statistics, a man who now rotted on the hulks at Portsmouth because Thorne had trusted the paper more than the person. The shame of that error burned in his gut, a coal-swallowed hole that refused to digest or pass, heating his blood with a slow, toxic fire. He could not do it again. He could not be the instrument that tuned the machinery of injustice while knowing the gears were ground from falsehoods. Yet the boots remained stationary, a silent sentinel guarding the threshold of his conscience, reminding him that the institution valued loyalty above truth and silence above all. Slowly, with an agonizing deliberateness that made his muscles tremble, Thorne resumed his sorting. He picked up a bill for coal delivery, smoothing the crease with a palm that felt clammy and alien, forcing his breathing to deepen, to mimic the rhythm of a man engaged in trivial labor. He would not run. He would not hide the letter yet. To snatch it now would be an admission of guilt, a signal to the watcher that the game was up. He let his eyes scan the invoice, reading nothing, seeing only the gray blur of the text while his mind screamed warnings. The seconds stretched, elongating into minutes that felt like hours, each one a stone added to the pile waiting to bury him. Then the sound returned. The boots turned, the heels striking the stone with a sharp click that echoed down the corridor, fading into the distant hum of the building's ventilation and the muffled chatter of clerks in the outer offices. They were gone for now. Thorne exhaled, a shuddering rush of air that emptied his lungs completely, and looked down at the ledger. The lie sat there, bold and unchallenged, waiting for his pen to copy it into the permanent record, to cement the fabrication into the history of the realm. He folded Pilkington's letter, the paper crackling softly, and pressed the crease flat with his thumbnail, imprinting the fold with a precision that bordered on violence. He would not copy it, not tonight. He slid the letter into the inner pocket of his frock coat, feeling the thin paper press against his ribs, a secret heartbeat against his own. The metal key to the box felt heavy in his waistcoat pocket, biting into his thigh through the fabric, a constant reminder of the burden he had just accepted. The room seemed smaller now, the walls closing in, the air thinner, as if the oxygen had been consumed by the sheer weight of the deception. He stood, his legs stiff, and blew out the gas jet, plunging the room into a gloom that felt safer, more honest than the lying light. Heat pressed down on Printing House Square like a physical weight, a sweltering blanket of coal smoke and July humidity that seeped through the brickwork and settled in the lungs. Inside the editorial room, the air tasted of acid and wet newsprint, a metallic tang that coated the tongue and lingered long after one had stepped out into the street. John Walter II stood over the shoulder of the typesetter, his shadow falling across the composing stick where metal sorts waited to be locked into place. He did not speak immediately, letting the rhythmic clatter of the presses in the adjacent hall fill the silence, a mechanical heartbeat that drowned out the distant traffic of the city. Sweat beaded on his upper lip, but he did not wipe it away. He stood as a monument to composure while the world around him sweated and panicked. There is only the feeling that the wolf is at the door, Give them the wolf. The typesetter nodded, a quick, jerky movement of submission, and reached for the composing stick. His fingers trembled slightly as he picked out the new letters, dropping the metal sorts into the tray with a soft click that was instantly swallowed by the roar of the press coming back to life. Walter watched the man work, his eyes cold and unblinking, measuring the speed of the composition against the urgency of the moment. He viewed the garrotting of James Pilkington not as a tragedy to be mourned, nor a crime to be solved with diligence and care, but as a lever, a singular, perfect point of pressure that could move the entire weight of the British public towards the conclusion he desired. The Penal Servitude Act needed fuel, and fear was the only coal that burned hot enough to drive the legislative engine. Tidal wave, Walter murmured, testing the phrase on his tongue as he watched the sheets fly from the cylinder. Yes, a tidal wave of violence unleashed by the ticket of leave men. He ignored the subordinate editor who hovered near the door, clutching a stack of corrected proofs that would never see the light of day, their contents too moderate, too reasonable for the market of fear. The younger man shifted his weight from one foot to the other, the leather of his boots creaking in the pause between the machine's strokes. He opened his mouth, perhaps to mention the police logs, perhaps to suggest a tempering of the language, but Walter raised a hand before a sound could escape. The public does not want nuance, Mr. Sterling. They want safety, so provide it. Sterling closed his mouth, the words dying in his throat, and stepped back into the shadows of the corridor. He vanished away from the heat and the noise and the moral absolute of the printing floor, leaving Walter alone with the machinery of truth. Here in the belly of the Times, fact was not a matter of record, but of circulation, a commodity to be manufactured and sold by the sheet. Walter tapped the desk with a rolled-up proof, the sound sharp and authoritative, dismissing the concern with a wave of his hand that felt final, like a judge passing sentence. The heat in the room was intense, sweat staining the collars of the clerks, but Walter remained cool, his moral detachment absolute. He signed off on the proof, the ink still wet, knowing that by dawn this paper will be in the hands of every frightened gentleman in London. The press began to turn, a mechanical beast consuming paper and exhaling panic. The great wheels began to turn, the pistons pumping with a rhythmic, hydraulic force that sent vibrations up through the floorboards and into the bones of everyone standing in the room. Paper fed in white and emerged grey with text, thousands of copies per hour, each one carrying the seed of panic that Walter had just planted with a few strokes of his pen. The smell of the ink was overpowering now, a thick, oily vapor that coated the back of the throat and lingered in the nostrils long after one had left the room. It was the scent of the new day, the aroma of breakfast for the city, and by dawn, every frightened clerk and trembling merchant in London would consume it with their coffee, digesting the lie until it became part of their own flesh. Walter watched the press churn, the paper blurring into a continuous white river, and felt a cold satisfaction settle in his chest, distinct from the sweltering heat of the room. He had done his duty. He had given the people what they asked for, even if they did not know they had asked for it. He signed the final proof with a flourish, the pen scratching harshly against the damp paper, the ink soaking in deep and black, permanent and undeniable. The press roared louder, a mechanical shriek that drowned out the distant church bells tolling the hour, drowning out the quiet voice of reason that might have suggested a different path. The city outside was waking up to a new reality, a London transformed by the word of John Walter II into a jungle where no man was safe, a place where the shadows held monsters created not by crime, but by the press that reported it. The first bundle of papers was tied with twine and thrown onto the waiting cart, the thud heavy and final. The driver cracked his whip, the sound sharp in the enclosed space, and the wheels groaned as they began to turn, carrying the panic out into the streets where it would take root and grow. Walter turned away from the window, his face obscured by the gloom, and walked back towards his desk, leaving the roaring machine to do its work. The heat remained, clinging to his coat, but he did not notice. He was already thinking of the evening edition, of how to tighten the screw just a little more. He picked up his hat from the stand by the door, the felt warm to the touch, and stepped out into the corridor where the air was marginally cooler. Sterling was still there, lingering near the water closet, looking as though he had been waiting for a reprieve that would not come. Walter paused, adjusting his gloves, and looked at the younger man with an expression that was neither cruel nor kind, merely administrative. "See that the Morning Post goes out within the hour. I want the suburbs reading this before breakfast." "Sir," Sterling said, his voice tight, "the logs from Whitehall, they haven't been verified." "Verification is a luxury for academics, Mr. Sterling. We are in the business of order." Walter moved past him, his boots clicking on the stone flagging, a steady rhythm that echoed down the hall. He did not look back. The street outside was grey with the early light, the fog lifting just enough to reveal the wet pavement and the huddled figures of newsboys already gathering at the gates. They shouted, their voices thin and sharp against the rumble of the carts, hawking the terror that lay folded under their arms. A gentleman in a top hat stopped to buy a copy, unfolding it immediately under the glare of a gas lamp that had not yet been extinguished by the dawn. He read the headline, his face tightening, and looked over his shoulder at the shadows of the alleyway as if expecting a garroter to leap from the gloom. Walter watched him from the doorway, unseen in the recess, and felt the weight of the institution settling on his shoulders. It was heavier than the fog, heavier than the coat he wore. He had lit the fire, and now he would stand back and watch it burn, knowing that the ashes would form the foundation of the new law. He stepped down from the curb, joining the flow of traffic that moved towards the temple, a single drop in the river of the city. Behind him, the presses continued to scream, a relentless, rhythmic demand for more, more, more. The ink was wet, the lie was set, and London woke up afraid. The sound of boots fading down the corridor was like the retreat of an army leaving a battlefield strewn with the debris of the day. Elias Thorne stood by the window, his forehead resting against the cool glass, watching the gas lamps flicker to life on Whitehall below. He waited. The clock on the mantel ticked, a dry wooden sound that measured out the seconds until the building belonged to him alone. "You staying on, then?" Gable leaned against the doorframe, his hat crushed in one hand, the brim dark with sweat. He did not step fully into the room, respecting the boundary of Thorne's solitude even as he breached it with speech. "Someone must reconcile the liaison sheets," Thorne said, without turning from the window. "Leave the dead to their paperwork, Elias. The ale's cold and the fog's coming up from the river." Gable shifted his weight, the leather of his boots creaking in the quiet. "There's a proper thirst on me that only Porter can fix." "Go on, Gable. I'll lock the outer door." "Don't say I didn't warn you when the gas runs low, for there's a chill in these walls that isn't in the air." Gable pushed off the frame, shaking his head. "Suit yourself, but don't blame me if the shadows start talking." Thorne heard the outer door slam, the latch clicking home with a finality that vibrated through the floor. He turned from the window. The room was now a cavern of shadows, the gas jets hissing softly above the desks, casting long, distorted shapes against the piles of correspondence. He moved to his own desk and retrieved the small iron key from the top drawer, wrapping it in a handkerchief to dull the metallic clink. The corridor outside was empty, the wallpaper peeling in strips near the ceiling where the damp had taken hold. He walked towards the Metropolitan Police liaison desk, a heavy construct of oak and iron situated in the alcove usually guarded by a sergeant. The air smelled of stale tobacco and the sour tang of ink that had dried on the blotting pads hours ago. Thorne raised his lantern, the glass cloudy with grime, and let the light sweep over the locked cabinet beneath the desk. He inserted the key. It resisted for a moment, the tumblers stiff with disuse, before yielding with a sharp click that sounded like a bone snapping in the quiet. Thorne held his breath, waiting for the echo to fade, but the building offered only the settling of timber and the distant cough of a night watchman 3 floors down. He pulled the door open. Inside, the ledgers were stacked in neat rows, their spines labeled with the divisions of the Metropolitan Police. He sought K Division, the jurisdiction covering Parliament Square. His fingers, stained permanently with the indigo of copying ink, traced the leather bindings until they found the correct volume. He lifted it out. The book was heavy, smelling of old paper and dust, a scent that rose to meet him like a greeting from a dead relative. He placed the ledger on the liaison desk and opened it to July 1862. The pages were filled with the cramped, vertical handwriting of the duty sergeants, each entry a small monument to the ordinary misery of the city. Thorne leaned closer, the lantern light pooling on the paper, illuminating the dates. It was the 16th of July, drunk and disorderly in Covent Garden, followed by the 17th with a charge of petty theft for a handkerchief taken from a gentleman. Then came the 18th of July, marked by assault during a public house dispute. He ran his finger down the column, the paper rough against his skin. There was no tidal wave here, no epidemic of violence, just the steady, grinding attrition of a population too crowded and too poor to live without friction. He turned the page to the date of Pilkington's assault. The entry was brief, noting the attack on the Member of Parliament, but the surrounding dates were devoid of the simultaneous garrottings the newspapers claimed had terrified the West End. "Ordinary," he whispered to the empty room. The word hung in the air, fragile and dangerous. If the logs were true, then the panic was a fabrication, a story sold by the penny press to fill columns and stir the blood of the reading public. He looked at the margins of the page, searching for amendments, for notes added in a different hand that might contradict the sergeant's initial report. There were none. The ink was uniform, the flow of the writing consistent. Thorne straightened his back, a vertebra popping in the silence. He knew the weight of what he held. It was not just a book of records. It was a contradiction of the public mood, a factual rebuke to the fear that was currently tightening its grip around the throat of London. He closed the ledger for a moment, resting his palms on the cover, feeling the texture of the leather under his skin. To publish this would be to accuse the Home Office of complicity, or worse, incompetence. They had allowed the narrative to spread, perhaps even encouraged it, to pave the way for the Penal Servitude Act. Thorne rubbed his spectacles with the handkerchief, the cloth already spotless, circling the glass until the fabric grew warm against his fingers. He needed to compare these entries with the press clippings he had collated in his private log, to map the divergence between fact and fiction line by line. He reached into his coat and pulled out his own notebook, the pages filled with red ink and frantic annotations. He laid it beside the police ledger. The visual contrast was stark. The official log was sparse and factual, while his counterlog bloomed with the exaggerations of the newspapers. He opened the police ledger again, turning back to the night of the attack. No other incidents reported within a 1-mile radius. The sentence sat on the page, immutable. Thorne traced the letters with a fingernail, pressing hard enough to indent the paper beneath. He verified with every touch that the panic was a phantom, a ghost conjured by editors who cared more for circulation than for truth. The gaslight flickered above him, the flame dipping as a draft moved through the room, casting his shadow against the shelves of files. For a moment, the shadow looked larger than he was, a giant trapped in a room of secrets, looming over the desk. He knew he could not publish this. The police commissioner would deny its authenticity, claiming the logs were incomplete or altered. The Home Office would disavow it to protect the integrity of the new legislation. Yet he could not leave it here, buried in the dark. He took a pencil from his pocket and hovered it over his own notebook, ready to transcribe the entry, to commit the truth to a second source that he could hide away. The pencil touched the paper. He wrote the date. He wrote the entry. He wrote the words "no other incidents." The graphite scratched against the page, a dry, rasping sound that seemed too loud in the stillness. He paused, listening. The building remained quiet, but the feeling of being watched prickled at the back of his neck, a sensation distinct from the heat of the room. He snapped the notebook shut and tucked it into his inner pocket, close to his heart. The ledger needed to be returned. He lifted the heavy book and slid it back into the cabinet, aligning the spine with the others until the row was perfect. He locked the cabinet door, the key turning smoothly this time, and wiped the handle with his handkerchief to remove any prints. He stood there for a moment, the lantern in one hand, the key in the other, listening to the rhythm of his own breathing. It was done. He had seen the truth, and it was nothing like the lie. He turned off the lantern, plunging the alcove into darkness, and began the walk back to his desk, the floorboards creaking under his weight. He would need to compare the ink tones next, to see if the press reports had been written before the crimes even occurred. The thought chilled him more than the draft from the window. He reached his desk and sat down, pulling the copy of the Times from his bag, ready to begin the comparison in the dim glow of the gas jet. The gas jet hissed, a serpent of sulfur fighting the damp that clung to the window panes. Elias Thorne dipped his pen, the nib scratching against the paper with a dry, rhythmic friction that matched the ticking of the mantel clock. 3 nights had bled into one another, the boundaries between sleep and wakefulness dissolving into a grey haze of ink stains and coffee dregs. He did not look up when the coal scuttle rattled in the hallway. His world had shrunk to the width of the memorandum before him. Statement of fact regarding incidents of violence, July 1862. The title sat innocuous enough, stripped of the alarmist flourishes that decorated the front pages of every penny dreadful from Fleet Street to the docks. He had spent hours pruning the adjectives, stripping the prose, until only the bone-white arithmetic remained. A column of figures here, a corresponding entry from the Metropolitan Police logs there. The disparity was not merely evident, it was screaming, a silent roar that threatened to tear the very wallpaper from the walls of the Home Office if given voice. He pressed the nib harder, correcting a smudge where his hand had trembled. The number 42 stared back at him. 42 alleged garrottings reported in the press. 6 confirmed by the constabulary. The rest were phantoms, ghosts conjured to sell copies and frighten the respectable classes into demanding blood. He blew on the wet ink, watching the sheen dull to a matte black. Bureaucracy was a shield, he told himself, though the metal felt thin in his grip. If he presented this as a correction of clerical error, a mere tidying of the records, perhaps Sir George Lewis would listen. Men of logic respected logic. They did not respect morality, not when the streets were clamoring for the hangman's noose, but they respected a balanced ledger. Thorne reached for the sheet of blue paper lying ready on the blotter. It was the standard color for internal correspondence, the hue of forgetfulness, of files destined to be buried under mountains of triviality until the paper yellowed and crumbled. He folded his memorandum with precise, creasing fingers, tucking it inside the blue cover. The act felt like dressing a corpse for a funeral it did not want. He stood, the chair legs scraping against the floorboards, with a sound that made him flinch. The room swayed slightly, a consequence of too little food and too much airless stagnation. He walked to the mirror hanging above the washbasin, avoiding the reflection of the gaslight that haloed his thinning hair. The man in the glass looked like a ghost himself, his complexion the color of old parchment, his eyes watery and rimmed with red. He adjusted his cravat, pulling the knot tight until it restricted his breath. Good. Let the discomfort keep him sharp. He practiced the opening line, whispering it to the condensation on the glass. Sir George, a misapprehension appears to have occurred regarding the statistical returns. Too aggressive. He tried again, softening the edges, blurring the accusation into a suggestion. It has come to my attention that certain discrepancies exist between the public narrative and the departmental logs. Better passive, safe. It placed the blame on the abstract concept of discrepancy rather than on the men who had curated the panic. Thorne knew he was lying by omission, crafting a sentence that would allow Lewis to save face while quietly dismantling the foundation of the Penal Servitude Act. But face was all they cared about. Truth was a luxury for academics and fools, and Thorne had no intention of playing the martyr. He grabbed his satchel, shoving the blue packet inside alongside his watch and a handkerchief that was already damp with sweat. He checked the time, precisely 10 minutes to the hour. Punctuality was the armor of the junior clerk. It suggested reliability, a mind ordered enough to be trusted with secrets. He extinguished the gas jet, plunging the room into a gloom that smelled of extinguished wick and stale tobacco. The street outside offered no relief. The fog had not lifted with the dawn. Instead, it had thickened, coiling around the lamp posts and soaking into the wool of his frock coat. It tasted of coal dust and the river, a metallic tang that coated the back of his throat. Thorne stepped onto the pavement, his boots clicking on the wet stone. He did not look left or right. To look was to invite the chaos of the city into his mind, to see the headlines plastered on every wall, theocurrency section, a ring reporting the latest outrage that never happened. He kept his eyes on the path ahead, walking with a stiff, jerky gait that he hoped projected purpose. Reason must prevail. The thought was a mantra, a fragile shield against the rising tide of nausea in his gut. He imagined the scene in Lewis's office, the cool air, the smell of leather and beeswax, the sound of a rational man acknowledging an error. Lewis was a lawyer, a man of statutes and precedents. Surely, when presented with irrefutable data, he would pause. He would see that the legislation they were rushing through Parliament was built on sand. The act would be delayed, perhaps amended. The hysteria would subside like a fever breaking. Thorne tightened his grip on the strap of his satchel, the leather biting into his palm. He was carrying the cure for a plague that no one admitted they had. A carriage rattled past, the wheels splashing mud onto the curb. Thorne stepped back, pressing himself against the cold brick of a shopfront. The driver did not look at him. No one looked at a man in a grey coat carrying a blue packet. He was invisible, a cog in the machine he hoped to jam. The irony sat heavy in his chest, a stone he could not dislodge. He checked his watch again, 5 minutes. He forced his legs to move, stepping off the curb and into the flow of pedestrians who shuffled through the mist like sleepwalkers. They talked of prices, of dinners, of the weather. None of them spoke of the 6 men who had actually been attacked, or the 42 who existed only in the imagination of editors. Thorne turned the corner towards Whitehall, the great stone facade of the Home Office looming out of the fog like a temple of silence. He straightened his spine, lifting his chin. He was not a whistleblower. He was a senior clerk correcting a file. There was a difference. One was a traitor, the other was a servant. He repeated the distinction until the words lost their meaning, becoming just sounds in the ringing of his ears. He reached the great doors, pausing for a fraction of a second to wipe his spectacles with the spotless handkerchief. The glass was clear. His vision was unobstructed. There was no reason to fail. He pushed the door open and stepped into the warmth of the foyer, the smell of floor wax and damp wool enveloping him instantly. The porter nodded, a familiar dip of the chin that acknowledged Thorne's presence without inviting conversation. Thorne nodded back, his throat too tight to speak. He walked towards the stairs, his boots sinking into the runner. The blue packet in his satchel felt heavier now, as if the paper itself had absorbed the weight of the lie he was about to challenge. He climbed the first step, then the second, counting them to keep the rhythm of his heart from betraying him. At the top of the stairs, the corridor stretched out, long and dimly lit, leading to the anteroom where the powerful waited. He could hear voices drifting from behind the closed doors, low and murmuring, punctuated by the occasional sharp laugh that sounded too loud in the hushed atmosphere. Thorne stopped outside the anteroom, his hand hovering over the handle. He took a breath, filling his lungs with the stale air of the corridor, and steadied his trembling fingers. He was ready. He had the numbers. He had the truth. He turned the handle and stepped inside, expecting to be greeted by the order of the state, unaware that the chaos he sought to fix was already seated behind the desk, waiting for him with a smile that did not reach its eyes. The door clicked shut behind him, severing the murmur of the corridor. Inside, the air stood still, preserved in a coolness that smelled of beeswax and old leather, devoid of the damp wool odor clinging to Thorne's own grey wool. Sir George Lewis sat behind a desk so clear it might have been a slab of ice. The only object upon it, a blotter of black cloth, and a silver pen rest aligned perfectly with the edge. Books lined the walls behind him, their spines uniform in calf binding, untouched by the grime of frequent handling. Thorne stepped forward, the carpet swallowing the sound of his boots, until he stood on the other side of the wood, close enough to see the fine pores in the polished surface. He placed the satchel on the floor. Lewis did not rise. He merely lifted his gaze, eyes pale and watery behind spectacles that caught the gaslight without reflecting it. There was no invitation to sit, no offer of refreshment, only the expectation that the clerk would remain standing while the state remained seated. Thorne reached into his pocket and withdrew the blue packet, the paper crisp against his fingertips. He slid it across the desk, stopping it precisely before the blotter. The memorandum, Sir George. Lewis looked at the packet, then at Thorne, then back to the packet. He did not touch it immediately. He let it lie there, a small blue island in a sea of mahogany, while the seconds stretched out like wire pulled too tight. Thorne kept his hands clasped behind his back, digging his nails into his own palms to stop them from trembling. He had rehearsed the opening line 100 times in the mirror, yet now his throat felt packed with cotton wool. Mr. Thorne, Lewis's voice was dry, stripped of inflection. You understand the current climate requires decisive action. The data suggests the climate is mistaken, sir. Lewis opened the packet. He turned the first page, then the second, his movements economical. He read quickly, his eyes scanning the columns of figures Thorne had spent 3 nights verifying against the parish logs. The only sound in the room was the rustle of paper, a dry friction that seemed to amplify the lack of any other noise. Thorne watched the man's face, searching for a flicker of surprise, a tightening of the jaw, anything to indicate that the truth was landing with force. Nothing changed. The face remained a mask of polite endurance. Lewis turned the final page and closed the folder. He pushed it back across the desk, the friction sounding loud in the quiet. Technically accurate, Lewis said. He capped the pen he had not used. Contextually irrelevant. So, the public does not suffer from statistics, Mr. Thorne. They suffer from fear. Lewis leaned back, the leather of his chair creaking, a single sharp note in the room. If the streets are perceived to be unsafe, then they are unsafe. The government's duty is to address the perception, regardless of the underlying arithmetic. But the legislation, Thorne said, the words rushing out before he could check them. The Penal Servitude Act is built upon these returns. If the returns are inflated, the act is a lie. Lewis picked up the silver pen rest and moved it 1 inch to the left. He did not look at Thorne when he spoke. It is a remedy for a malady that exists in the public mind. Whether the malady exists in the pavement is of secondary consequence. Lewis finally raised his eyes. They were cold, devoid of malice, but also devoid of mercy. We are not here to educate the populace on the nuances of crime rates. We are here to ensure they feel protected. Thorne felt the heat rise in his neck, a prickling sensation that spread to his hairline. He wanted to slam his hand on the desk, to shout that 6 men had been attacked while 42 were fabrications, that lives would be ruined by a panic manufactured in editing rooms. He opened his mouth, but the words stuck, tangled in the realization that Lewis knew all of this already. The dismissal was not an error, it was policy. "You wish me to file this?" Thorne asked. His voice sounded thin, reedy. "Archive miscellaneous." Lewis reached for a fresh sheet of paper, dipping his pen into the inkwell. "And you will return to your duties. The session is concluded." Thorne stood rooted. The blue packet sat between them, a testament to facts that no longer mattered. He looked at the hand holding the pen, steady and poised to write orders that would bind men to servitude based on lies. He looked at the books on the wall, silent witnesses to a bureaucracy that valued order over truth. He needed to speak. He needed to say that this was wrong, that history would judge them for choosing comfort over accuracy. "Sir George, I must insist." Lewis raised his hand. The gesture was slight, a mere lifting of the palm, yet it carried the weight of a closing gate. Thorne's voice died in his throat. He stood there, mouth slightly open, the protest unsaid hanging in the air like smoke. Lewis did not look up from the paper he was now writing on, the scratch of the nib the only acknowledgement of Thorne's presence. The message was clear. To argue further was insubordination. To persist was career suicide. Thorne reached out and took the blue packet. The paper felt warm now, heated by the rejection. He tucked it under his arm, the edge digging into his ribs. He turned away from the desk, his boots making no sound on the carpet. He walked towards the door, each step feeling heavier than the last, as if the floor was tilting against him. He reached for the handle, his fingers brushing the cold brass. "Close the door behind you, Mr. Thorne." Thorne pulled the door open. The noise of the corridor rushed in, a sudden wave of murmurs and footsteps that felt invasive after the sterile quiet of the office. He stepped out into the hall, the blue packet clutched against his side. The door clicked shut behind him, sealing Lewis back inside his sanctuary of order. Thorne stood alone in the corridor, the paper burning against his ribs. He looked down the long hall towards the stairs, towards the exit, towards the rain he knew was waiting outside. He had the truth in his hand. He had nowhere to put it. He began to walk. Boots struck stone. The corridor stretched ahead like a throat ready to swallow sound, lined with doors that held secrets thicker than the plaster walls. Thorne kept his gaze fixed on the scuffed skirting board, counting the panels to steady his breathing, though the air itself felt solid, a gelatinous weight pressing against his lungs. He clutched the blue packet tighter against his ribs, the edge digging into his side like a rib bone seeking purchase. "Thorne!" The voice came from behind, sharp and familiar. He did not stop walking, hoping the sound of his own steps would mask the recognition, but the footsteps behind him quickened, slapping against the floor with an impatient rhythm. Thorne, hold a moment. Mr. Gantry emerged from the shadow of a pillar, his face flushed with the exertion of climbing the stairs, a sheen of perspiration making his forehead gleam under the flickering light. He wore a waistcoat too tight for his stomach, the buttons straining against the fabric as he breathed. Thorne halted, turning slowly, ensuring the blue packet remained hidden behind the line of his arm. Mr. Gantry. Seen the afternoon edition? Gantry wiped his brow with a handkerchief that had seen better days, the linen grey with ink and dust. The Telegraph is screaming about another attack near Holborn, 3 men this time, or so they say. Rumour, Thorne said. The word felt dry in his throat. Rumour sells, Gantry corrected, stepping closer, the smell of stale tobacco and onions clinging to his coat. And panic keeps the government in session. You've been with Lewis. Thorne shifted his weight. The paper crinkled, a soft betrayal of sound. I have. And, Gantry leaned in, eyes bright with the hunger of a man who trades in gossip for currency. Does the bill pass? Will they hang them all from the yardarm? The session is concluded. Thorne took a step back, his shoulder brushing the cold plaster of the wall. The details are not for discussion. Come now, we are all friends here. Gantry laughed, a short, barking sound that echoed too loudly in the narrow space, unless there is something to hide. Thorne felt the heat rise in his neck, a prickling sensation that had nothing to do with the stifling air of the corridor. He thought of Lewis's hand, lifting slightly to silence him, the gesture carrying the weight of a closing gate. He thought of the 6 men attacked, while 42 were fabrications, the numbers swimming in his head like ink in water. To speak now would be to invite Gantry's pity, or worse, his scrutiny. There is nothing to hide, Thorne said, only work to be done. Work, Gantry repeated, tasting the word. Always work, while the city burns. The city is not burning. It feels like it. Gantry gestured down the hall, towards the windows where the fog pressed against the glass, yellow and thick as bruised flesh. People are afraid to walk the pavement after dark. Shopkeepers are buying revolvers, and we sit here, shuffling paper. Thorne looked at the man, really looked at him, seeing the fear behind the curiosity. Gantry was not malicious. He was merely a creature of the machine, fed on the scraps of information that leaked from rooms like Lewis's. He believed the newspapers because he needed the world to be simple, where villains wore caps and heroes wore badges. Go home, Gantry, Thorne said, his voice quiet yet carrying enough to fill the space as he added that the day was done. Is it? Gantry glanced at the packet hidden behind Thorne's arm, his eyes narrowing for a fraction of a second before the mask of cheerfulness slipped back into place. Perhaps, but the night is just beginning. Gantry turned away, his boots scuffing the stone as he walked back towards the stairs, whistling a tune that was popular in the music halls, something about a ghost and a grave. Thorne watched him go, waiting until the sound of the whistling faded into the hum of the building. He stood alone in the corridor, the blue packet burning against his ribs. He looked down the long hall towards the stairs, towards the exit, towards the rain he knew was waiting outside. He had the truth in his hand. He had nowhere to put it. The urge to follow Gantry, to shout the numbers after him, rose in his chest like bile. He imagined the scene, the confrontation on the stairs, the disbelief, the laughter. He imagined the packet torn from his grip, the facts scattered like confetti on the pavement. It would change nothing. Lewis was right about the perception, if nothing else. The public wanted a monster, not a spreadsheet. Thorne turned away from the stairs. He walked towards the record room, his steps slower now, deliberate. The door stood at the end of the wing, iron-bound and heavy, guarded by a clerk who slept more than he watched. Thorne knew the key was hidden under the mat, a secret kept by those who needed access after hours. He reached down and felt the cold metal beneath the fiber. Inside, the air smelled of rust and old glue, the scent of history decaying in the dark. He lit a gas jet, the hiss of the flame sounding like a serpent in the silence. The shelves rose up around him, towering columns of ledgers that stretched into the shadows. He walked to his desk, the mahogany scarred by decades of bureaucratic scratching. He placed the blue packet on the surface, smoothing the creases with a hand that trembled slightly. He opened the top drawer and removed a blank ledger, the pages crisp and white. He dipped his pen into the inkwell, the nib gleaming in the light. He looked at the blue packet, then at the blank page. He could copy the true figures here, create a record that existed outside the official chain. He could hide it in the stacks, buried among the tax returns of 1840. The pen hovered over the paper. A single drop of ink fell, blooming like a black flower on the white page. He watched it spread, the edges feathering out into the fibers. He thought of Pilkington, dead in the street, his letters damp with rain. He thought of Lewis, capping his pen, the friction sounding loud in the quiet. Thorne began to write. He did not copy the figures. He wrote a date and a name and a location. He wrote nothing else. He closed the ledger and placed it on the shelf behind him, behind a row of bound volumes on customs duty. He took the blue packet and tucked it inside his coat, against his heart. He blew out the gas jet. The room plunged into darkness, the smell of extinguished flame hanging in the air. He walked towards the door, feeling his way along the shelves, his fingers brushing the spines of the books. He reached the handle and pulled it open. The noise of the corridor rushed in, a sudden wave of murmurs and footsteps that felt invasive after the sterile quiet of the room. He stepped out into the hall, the packet clutched against his side. The door clicked shut behind him, sealing the darkness back inside. Thorne stood alone in the corridor, the paper burning against his ribs. He looked down the long hall towards the exit, towards the street, towards the fog. He had the truth in his hand. He had nowhere to put it. He began to walk. His boots struck the flagstones, a rhythmic clatter that echoed too loudly in the empty wing, each step sounding like a verdict delivered in a closed court. The corridor stretched before him, a throat of brick and mortar swallowing the light from the single burner left burning near the exit. Thorne kept his left hand pressed flat against his waistcoat, fingers splayed to hold the blue packet steady against the ribcage, feeling the crisp edge of the paper dig into his skin with every stride. He did not hurry. Hurrying suggested guilt, and guilt was a scent that men like Hobbes could smell through the thick wool of a uniform. The air here was colder than in the record room, drafts sneaking in from the ill-fitting sash windows that overlooked the courtyard, carrying the damp rot of the Thames mud below. At the end of the hall, the great oak door stood barred by an iron latch, and before it sat a stool occupied by the night watchman. Hobbes looked up from a newspaper spread across his knees, the pages rustling like dry leaves in a windless wood. He was a man composed of gristle and old tobacco, his face mapped with the red veins of a lifetime spent guarding doors against men who wished to enter or leave without permission. He did not stand when Thorne approached, merely shifting a heavy leg to block the path, his truncheon resting casual on his thigh. "Late, Mr. Thorne." Hobbes's voice was a gravel grind, low and suspicious. Clock struck 10 minutes past the hour. "Overtime, Hobbes." Thorne stopped 3 feet from the stool, keeping his posture loose, though his heart hammered a frantic rhythm against the hidden packet. "Forgot a brief on the desk. Sir George requires it first thing." "Sir George went home an hour ago." Hobbes folded the newspaper slowly, creasing the spine with a thumb that looked like a gnarled root. "Saw him leave. Carriage came round." "Then it is for the Morning Post." Thorne lied smoothly, the words tasting of ash in his mouth, a familiar flavor from years of smoothing over departmental errors. "Do not make a ledger of it, man. I am weary." Hobbes studied him, eyes narrowing in the gloom, searching for the tremor of a lie in the set of a jaw or the twitch of an eyelid. The watchman stood then, his joints cracking audibly, and reached for the lantern hanging on a hook beside the door. He lifted it, the glass smudged with finger marks, and held the light up towards Thorne's face, the flame flickering in the draught from the keyhole. "Coat's bulging, sir." Hobbes pointed the lantern beam at Thorne's left side, where the blue packet created a distinct rectangle beneath the frock coat. "Looks like more than a brief." "Drafts, nothing more." Thorne shifted his stance, turning slightly to shield the side, a movement that drew Hobbes's gaze like a magnet. "Unless you wish to search me, I can wait while you fetch the undersecretary." The threat hung in the air, delicate as spun glass. Hobbes knew the hierarchy as well as he knew the layout of the building, and he knew that accusing a senior clerk of theft was a quicker route to the workhouse then ignoring a bulge. He lowered the lantern, the light swinging away from Thorne's face to illuminate the dust motes dancing between them. "Pass," Hobbes muttered, stepping aside to unhook the latch. "Don't let the rain take you." Thorne did not thank him. He pushed the door open and stepped out into the night, the latch engaging behind him with a solid thud that severed the connection to the safety of the interior. The street hit him like a physical blow, the humidity of the July night wrapping around his throat, thick with the smell of coal smoke and horse manure. Rain was not falling, but the air was heavy with it, a mist that clung to the skin and soaked into the wool within minutes. He pulled his coat tighter, the blue packet now damp against his chest, and turned onto Whitehall. Carriages rumbled past, the iron rims of their wheels sparking against the granite setts, splashing mud onto the pavement where pedestrians huddled under umbrellas. Thorne walked against the flow, heading towards Fleet Street, driven by a compulsion he could not name. He needed to see the presses. He needed to witness the machinery that turned his quiet statistics into public panic. The distance was manageable, perhaps 20 minutes at a brisk pace, but the fog made landmarks dissolve into grey shapes, forcing him to rely on the sound of the city to navigate. He passed a group of men loitering outside a public house, their voices loud and slurred, laughing at a joke that ended in a cough. They watched him pass, eyes tracking the cut of his coat, judging him by the cloth rather than the man beneath. Near Temple Bar, the sound changed. The rhythmic clatter of carriages was replaced by the deeper, mechanical thrum of printing presses vibrating through the pavement. Thorne stopped outside the building where the Times was prepared for distribution, the windows glowing yellow against the dark. Through the glass, he could see men moving like shadows, feeding paper into machines that chewed and spat out the news with terrifying efficiency. A wagon stood at the curb, boys loading bundles of newsprint onto the back, their movements hurried, frantic. Thorne stepped closer, pressing himself into the shadow of a doorway to avoid the light from the wagon. One of the boys dropped a bundle, the papers scattering across the wet stones. Thorne watched as the boy scrambled to retrieve them, the headline facing up on the pavement. "Garrote Gang at Large," the bold type screamed, the ink still wet and gleaming in the gaslight. "Public in danger." He crouched, ignoring the mud soaking into his trousers, and picked up one of the scattered sheets. The date was tomorrow's, printed hours in advance. The article cited a surge in violence that did not exist, quoting figures he knew to be fabricated, weaving a narrative of terror from whole cloth. He held the paper in both hands, feeling the vibration of the press through the soles of his boots, a physical manifestation of the lie spreading through the city. A man bumped past him, snatching the paper from his grip without a word, tossing a halfpenny onto the ground as payment for the stolen copy. "Extra, read all about it," the man shouted, already running towards the corner, the paper clutched like a weapon. "Murder in the Square." Thorne stood alone on the pavement, the rain finally beginning to fall, cold drops striking his face like needles. He looked down at his empty hands, stained with the mud of the street and the ink of the lie. The blue packet in his coat felt heavier now, a dead weight pulling him towards the earth. He could not fight the machines. He could not shout down the thunder of the presses, but he could keep the record. He turned away from the glowing windows of the printing house, walking back into the fog, towards the river and the dark water waiting there. He had a destination now, though he wished he did not. Rain struck his collar, cold and insistent, soaking the wool until it clung to his neck like a wet hand. Thorne pulled his head down, shielding his face with the upturned lapel, and walked. The street sloped towards the Thames, the cobbles slick with a glaze of oil and water that reflected the gaslights in fractured, trembling shards. He kept to the edge of the pavement, avoiding the gutter where the runoff gathered in black pools, smelling of rot and industrial waste. Each step required care, a deliberate placement of the boot to avoid the splash that might draw the eye of a passing constable. The bundle inside his coat pressed against his ribs, a hard rectangle of paper and truth that felt heavier with every yard gained. Fleet Street gave way to the Strand, the thoroughfare widening as it approached the river, the buildings falling back to allow the sky to press lower upon the city. Thorne did not hurry. Hurrying invited suspicion, and suspicion invited questions he could not answer without lying too plainly. He walked with the steady, measured gait of a clerk leaving late office hours, a performance of normalcy for the benefit of any watcher in the shadows. The fog thickened near the water, curling around the lamp posts like smoke from an extinguished candle, obscuring the faces of the few souls still abroad. A hansom cab rattled past, the driver hunched under an oilskin cape, the horse's breath pluming white in the damp air. Thorne stepped into the recess of a doorway to let it pass, the wheels spraying mud against the hem of his trousers. He waited until the sound of the hooves faded before continuing. Blackfriars Bridge loomed ahead, a skeletal arch of iron against the gloom, the river beneath it a void of moving blackness. The toll house stood at the entrance, a small brick box glowing with a single yellow light. A man sat inside, visible through the smudged glass, smoking a pipe with slow, rhythmic puffs. Thorne approached the booth, the sound of his boots on the wooden planking of the bridge echoing hollowly. The toll collector opened the slide, a face lined with deep creases appearing in the gap. "Late crossing," the man said, his voice rough with tobacco. He held out a hand, palm up, expecting the penny. "Business detained me," Thorne replied, fishing a coin from his waistcoat pocket. His fingers fumbled slightly as the metal grew slippery with rain, and then he dropped the penny into the man's hand. "River's rising," the collector noted, closing the slide but not retreating. He watched Thorne through the glass, eyes narrowed. "Folks say the dead walk the banks when the water's this high." "Folks say many things." Thorne turned towards the bridge span, eager to put the booth between himself and the inquisitive gaze. "Mind the gaps," the man called after him, the slide rattling shut, planks loose near the middle. Thorne nodded, though the man could not see it, and stepped onto the main span. The wind picked up here, unobstructed by the buildings, whipping the mist into his eyes. He gripped the iron railing, the metal cold enough to burn his palm through the glove. Below, the Thames moved with a sluggish, heavy power, carrying the debris of the city towards the sea. A barge drifted past, silent save for the creak of timber, the lights on deck low and shielded. He paused halfway across, leaning over the railing to look down at the water. It offered a solution, permanent and absolute. To drop the bundle into the black current would be to end the trouble, to let the truth dissolve into the silt where it could harm no one. His hand moved to his coat, fingers brushing the damp paper through the wool. He could feel the texture of the ribbon tying the letters, the sharp edge of the seal. To destroy it would be an act of mercy, perhaps, to save himself from the scrutiny that would surely follow if the theft were discovered. But Pilkington had died for these figures. To drown them now would be to drown the MP with them, a second execution in the dark. Thorne straightened, pulling his hand away from the coat as if the paper had burned him. He turned his back on the river and continued towards the Lambeth shore. The south bank was quieter, the streets narrower, lined with warehouses that stood shuttered and dark. He navigated the labyrinth of alleys leading to his lodgings, a set of rooms above a chandler's shop in a street that smelled of tallow and soap. The key felt heavy in his hand as he unlocked the street door, the lock sticking slightly before yielding with a metallic click. He climbed the stairs, the wood groaning under his weight, counting the steps to keep his mind from drifting to the consequences of the night. 12 steps to the first landing, 14 to the door of his rooms. Inside, the air was stale, trapped heat from the day lingering beneath the ceiling. Thorne did not light the gas. He moved by memory to the desk, sweeping a stack of ledgers aside to clear a space. He removed the bundle from his coat, placing it on the mahogany surface. The paper was wet, leaving a dark stain on the wood. He stood over it, breathing hard, the silence of the room pressing against his ears. There was no sound from the street below, no rattle of wheels, only the distant buoy bell on the river marking the hours. He opened the drawer of the desk and retrieved a small tin box, the kind used for storing needles or buttons. He placed the bundle inside, fitting the corners carefully, and closed the lid. It was not a secure hiding place, not truly, but it was better than the pocket. He locked the box and placed it on the top shelf of the bookcase, behind a row of legal volumes that had not been opened in years. There, it was done. The evidence was safe for now. Thorne moved to the window, pulling the curtain aside a fraction to look down at the street. The gas lamp outside cast a pool of light on the wet pavement, illuminating the rain as it fell in steady sheets. The street was empty. He let the curtain fall back into place and turned to remove his coat. As he shrugged the wool from his shoulders, a sound came from the stairwell, a footstep, slow, deliberate, stopping on the landing outside his door. Thorne froze, his hands still inside the sleeves of his coat. The handle of the door did not turn, but the shadow beneath the frame shifted, blocking the light from the hall. Someone was standing there, waiting. He reached for the letter opener on the desk, his fingers closing around the cold steel, and held his breath until his lungs burned. The footstep came again, retreating this time, fading down the stairs with a cautious rhythm. Thorne did not move. He stood in the dark, the letter opener in his hand, listening to the rain wash the city clean outside while the danger remained within. Steel bit into his palm. Thorne loosened his grip before the pain could draw a sound from his throat, letting the weapon rest lightly on the desk surface. He counted the seconds between the retreating footsteps and the next noise, a habit born of the office clock, but applied here to the rhythm of a potential intruder. 100, 200. The house settled around him, timber contracting in the cooling air with sharp clicks that mimicked the tread of a boot. He did not move towards the door. To approach it would be to invite a confrontation. He was neither armed nor trained to win, and the bundle behind the legal volumes felt heavy despite being out of sight. A knock came, not the tentative tap of a stranger, but the solid, proprietary rap of someone who held the lease. Thorne exhaled, a slow release of air that fogged briefly in the chill of the unlit room. He slid the letter opener into the pocket of his waistcoat, the metal cold against his ribs, and crossed the floorboards. They did not creak. He had paid extra for these rooms because of the solid joists, a decision now vindicated by the silence of his approach. He placed his hand on the latch. "Mr. Thorne," the voice was muffled by the wood, female-edged, with the suspicion of a woman who knows the sound of her own house better than its tenants. "I heard a disturbance." Thorne opened the door a crack, keeping the chain fastened. The hallway gas jet had been turned low, casting a sickly yellow smear across the wallpaper. Mrs. Gantry stood there in her dressing gown, a shawl pulled tight over her grey hair, holding a candle that guttered in the draught from the stairs. "Merely a volume, Mrs. Gantry," Thorne said, keeping his voice level. "It slipped from the stack." She peered through the gap, her eyes narrowing as they adjusted to the darkness behind him. The candlelight caught the deep lines of her face, emphasizing the skepticism in her brow. At this hour, it sounded like a man walking. "Insomnia drives me to pace." He offered a thin smile that felt like a crack in dry plaster, explaining that the city noise keeps him awake before apologizing for the concern. Mrs. Gantry shifted her weight, the candle flame dancing wildly for a second before steadying. She did not lower the candle. "There was a man downstairs earlier, asking for you." The air in the hallway seemed to thicken, pressing against Thorne's chest. He kept his hand on the latch, the metal digging into his thumb. "Asking for me." "Before you returned, he waited near the shop." She lifted the candle higher, inspecting his face rather than the room. "He said he had a parcel. When I told him you were out, he left, though he looked like he intended to come back." Thorne's throat tightened. He had crossed the bridge unseen, or so he had believed. The shadow on the landing earlier had not been a random thief. Did he give a name? "None." She lowered the candle, the light retreating from his face. "Lock your chain, Mr. Thorne. I don't hold with strangers loitering near the door. It brings the wrong sort of attention." "I will secure it." "See that you do." She turned, the shawl rustling like dry leaves. "And keep the gas down. The bill is already higher than last quarter." Thorne waited until he heard the click of her door on the floor below before sliding the latch shut. He leaned his forehead against the wood, the grain rough against his skin. The encounter had not relieved the tension. It had merely given it a shape. Someone knew he was here. The information about his lodgings was not public knowledge, restricted to the Home Office personnel files and the landlord. If the office was watching him, the game was already lost. If it was the press or the men behind the panic, then the bundle behind the books was a death warrant. He pushed away from the door and moved back to the desk. The darkness felt less like a cover now and more like a cage. He struck a match, the sulfur flare bright and sudden, and lit the gas jet on the desk. The hiss of the burner filled the room, a small, controlled violence. He needed to see the hiding place. He dragged the chair over to the bookcase and climbed onto the seat, reaching up to the top shelf. His fingers brushed the spines of the legal volumessa chitty on contracts, Archbold's pleadinger, until they found the tin box. He pulled it down. The lid was secure. He opened it anyway, needing to confirm the reality of the paper inside. The letters lay there, damp still, the black ribbon stark against the white stock. Pilkington's handwriting stared up at him, the ink dried to a dull brown. These words had killed the MP, or at least contributed to the silence that allowed the killing to happen without question. Thorne ran a finger over the top sheet. He could not stay here. Mrs. Gantry's warning was not merely landlordly fretfulness. It was a signal. The man downstairs would return, and next time he would not knock. Thorne closed the box and shoved it into the inner pocket of his coat. The weight dragged on the fabric, pulling the lapel down. He blew out the gas jet, plunging the room back into gloom. The rain had stopped, but the fog would be thickening near the river, providing cover for movement, but also concealing pursuit. He needed to get the evidence to a place where it could not be easily seized. The Home Office safe was an option, but if the corruption reached the permanent undersecretary, walking into Whitehall was walking into a trap. He needed an intermediary, someone with access to the press who was not beholden to the Home Office chain of command. He moved to the window and lifted the curtain. The street below was empty, the wet pavement reflecting the single gas lamp like a mirror. A hansom cab rattled past in the distance, the wheels humming on the wet stone. Thorne let the curtain drop. He would have to go to the Times office on Printing House Square. John Walter II was a man of principle, or at least of principle sufficient to protect a story that sold copies. If Thorne could reach him before the morning editions went to press, the narrative might be shifted. It was a desperate gamble, relying on the very machinery of distortion to correct the record. Thorne pulled his coat tight around the box and opened the door. The hallway was empty, the gas jet still turned low. He descended the stairs, counting the steps again, though the rhythm offered no comfort this time. At the street door, he paused, listening for the sound of breathing in the shadows of the shop front. Nothing. He slipped the bolt and stepped out into the night. The air was cold, smelling of wet wool and coal smoke. He turned towards the river, keeping to the shadows of the buildings, moving away from the safety of his room, and towards the heart of the machinery he intended to break. Boots struck the wet stone, a sharp click, then swallowed by the damp air. Thorne kept to the edge of the pavement, where the shadows pooled thickest beneath the awnings of shuttered shops. The city breathed around him, a slow, congested inhalation of coal smoke and river mud that coated the back of his throat. He pulled his collar up, not against the cold, but to hide the line of his jaw from any passerby who might glance too long. The tin box sat inside his coat, a hard rectangle pressing against his sternum. Every step shifted the weight, a reminder of the paper within. A hansom cab rattled out of the mist ahead, the horse's hooves slipping slightly on the slick cobbles before finding purchase. Thorne raised a hand. The driver pulled the reins, the vehicle lurching to a halt beside the curb. Leather creaked. The horse snorted, a plume of steam rising from its nostrils to mix with the hanging vapor. "Where to, Governor?" The driver leaned down, his face obscured by the brim of a hat stained with grease and rain. Thorne hesitated. Giving a destination was a commitment, a trail of breadcrumbs left for anyone following. But walking the whole distance to Printing House Square would take an hour, and the night was wearing on. "Printing House Square," Thorne said, his voice sounding thin and stripped of authority by the wind. "The Times building." "Late for the editions," the driver muttered, shifting his weight on the perch. "Press'll be running hot. You won't get in." "Take me there." Thorne opened the door. The interior smelled of stale tobacco and wet wool, the upholstery damp to the touch. He climbed in, the springs groaning under his slight frame. "And drive quickly. I will pay extra for speed." "Extra means whips, not just shillings." The driver snapped the reins. The horse surged forward. Thorne sat back as the cab swung into the flow of the street. The wheels hummed, a low vibration that traveled up through the seat and into his spine. He watched the gas lamps blur past through the grimy window, each one a yellow eye struggling against the gloom. His hand drifted to the inner pocket of his coat, fingers brushing the metal lid of the box. If Walter refused him, if the editor dismissed the letters as the ravings of a disgruntled clerk, then Thorne would have burned his own bridge without lighting the way for anyone else. The Home Office would see his absence as confirmation of guilt. They would say he fled with the records. They would say he was part of the leak. Rain's picking up, the driver called back over the rumble. Best keep the window shut unless you want a soaking. Leave it, Thorne said. He needed the air. The cab smelled of trapped anxiety, of men who rode in silence to avoid conversation. I need to see the road. Suit yourself. The cab turned onto Fleet Street. The noise here was louder, the rattle of other carriages competing with the distant shout of newsboys hawking the early morning sheets. Even at this hour, the machines were churning. Ink was being laid on paper while the truth sat hidden in Thorne's coat. He thought of Pilkington's handwriting, the specific loop of the P in his signature. A dead man's script carried more weight than a living clerk's testimony. That was the geometry of the situation. The dead were safe, the living were liable. The horse slowed as they approached the square. The massive bulk of the printing house loomed out of the darkness, brick walls stained black by decades of smoke. Lights burned in the upper windows, rectangular patches of orange in the grey facade. The cab stopped. Thorne reached for his purse, counting out the coins with trembling fingers. He handed them up through the trap. "Keep the change," he said. "Thank ye, Governor." The driver pocketed the money without looking down. "You want me to wait?" Thorne paused, one foot on the pavement. If he sent the cab away, he was committed. If he kept it, he had an escape route, but also a witness. "No," Thorne said, "go." The driver shrugged and snapped the reins. The cab moved off, disappearing into the mist almost immediately, leaving Thorne alone on the corner. He stood for a moment, listening to the fading clatter of wheels. Then he turned to the building. The main doors were locked, bolted against the public, but a smaller side entrance stood ajar, propped open by a wedge of wood. Light spilled out onto the wet steps. Thorne climbed the stairs. His boots made no sound on the stone. He reached the doorway and paused, peering into the corridor beyond. The smell of ink was stronger here, acidic and sharp, mingling with the scent of hot metal from the presses. Voices drifted from further inside, men shouting coordinates over the mechanical roar. "Who goes there?" A figure stepped out from the shadows near the wall. A porter, wearing a dark apron stained with black smudges. He held a lantern low, the light catching the sharp angles of Thorne's face. "I need to see Mr. Walter," Thorne said. He kept his hands visible, away from the coat pocket. "It is urgent." "Mr. Walter don't see clerks at this hour." The porter shifted the lantern, the beam sweeping over Thorne's worn frock coat. "Come back during posting." "I am not a clerk seeking employment." Thorne took a step forward into the light. "I have information regarding the Pilkington affair, regarding the panic." The porter stiffened. The name hung in the air, heavier than the smoke. He lowered the lantern slightly, though his grip on the handle tightened. "Pilkington's dead," the porter said. "Nothing he has to say matters now." "It matters to the living." Thorne could feel the sweat cooling on his neck. "Tell him Elias Thorne is here, from the Home Office. Tell him I have the logs." The porter studied him for a long moment, the silence stretching until the distant clatter of the press seemed to fill the gap. Then he jerked his head towards the interior. "Wait here," the porter said. "Don't move." He turned and vanished into the corridor, his boots scuffing against the floor. Thorne remained by the door, the draft chilling the sweat on his skin. He listened to the porter's footsteps recede, then stopped. Another sound emerged, not the press, not the wind, footsteps approaching from the street behind him. Slow, deliberate. Thorne turned his head slightly, eyes catching the reflection of a figure standing beneath the gas lamp across the square. A man in a long coat, smoking a cigar, the ember glowing bright in the dark. He was not looking at the building. He was looking at Thorne. The porter's voice echoed from the hallway. "Mr. Walter will see you." Thorne stepped inside, pulling the door closed against the street, but the image of the glowing cigar remained burned on his retina. The trap was not inside. It was waiting for him to leave. The door clicked shut, severing the damp breath of the street and leaving Thorne in a corridor that smelled of wet wool and heated iron. The porter had vanished into the gloom, leaving only the echo of his scuffing boots to mark the direction of travel. Thorne stood still, letting his eyes adjust to the dimness, where the gas jets hissed like agitated serpents against the brickwork. He could feel the weight of the logs in his inner pocket, a hard rectangle pressing against his ribs, heavier than lead. "Move," the porter called from the shadows, his voice stripped of the earlier hesitation. "Up the stairs, mind the steps." Thorne stepped forward, his boots finding the stone treads with a caution that felt unnatural in a building dedicated to noise. The air grew thicker as he ascended, saturated with the acrid tang of printing ink and the oily residue of machinery. Above, the rhythmic clackish thud of the presses vibrated through the soles of his feet, a mechanical heartbeat that drowned out the traffic of the city below. It was a sound of industry, of certainty, of facts being manufactured by the ton. They emerged onto a gallery that overlooked the main floor, a cavernous space where great wheels turned and men in aprons moved with the frantic energy of ants disturbed. The heat here was physical, a wall of it that pressed against Thorne's face and fogged his spectacles instantly. He fumbled for his handkerchief, wiping the glass with trembling fingers, but the moisture returned before he could lift his head. "Wait," the porter said, gesturing to a heavy oak door at the far end of the gallery. "He's finishing a proof." Thorne nodded, though the man was already turning away. He leaned against the railing, looking down at the floor where sheets of newsprint flew from the rollers, still wet, still smelling of fresh lies. "Garrotting plague," one headline screamed in bold black type, the ink not yet dry, "ticket of leave terror." The words swam before him, distorted by the heat haze rising from the floor. Down there, men were feeding the panic, quite literally feeding the machine that would devour the liberties of thousands. And he stood above them, holding the truth in his coat, useless as a stone in a flood. The oak door opened. A man stood in the frame, silhouetted against the bright light of the office behind him. John Walter II. The editor did not look like a villain. He looked tired, his collar loosened, his face gray with the exhaustion of a man who has been arguing with the dead for too long. "Mr. Thorne," Walter said. His voice was flat, devoid of the drama that filled his pages. "The porter says you have logs." "I have the official returns," Thorne said, stepping away from the railing. His voice sounded thin in the vastness of the room. "From the Home Office, the ones that were not published." Walter stepped back, holding the door open. "Come in, the noise out there makes conversation impossible." Thorne crossed the gallery, the floorboards groaning under his weight. He passed the open door and entered the office, a sanctuary of relative quiet where the air was cooler and smelled of cigar smoke and old paper. Maps of London covered the walls, pinned with red flags that marked the sites of recent assaults. Too many flags. A forest of red where the statistics said there should be a handful of weeds. "Close it," Walter said, moving to his desk. He picked up a pair of spectacles and polished them on his sleeve, a gesture so similar to Thorne's own that it made his stomach turn. "Now, tell me why you have dragged me from my bed with paperwork I could summon with a warrant." "Because a warrant would be seen," Thorne said. He reached into his coat and withdrew the bundle of logs wrapped in oilcloth. He placed them on the desk, between them. "And because if you summon them, they will arrive altered." Walter paused, the spectacles hovering halfway to his face. He looked at the bundle, then at Thorne, his eyes sharp and assessing. "Altered," Walter repeated. "You accuse the Home Office of falsifying the returns." "I accuse them of survival," Thorne said. He felt a sudden surge of anger, hot and bright, cutting through his usual caution. "The panic sells papers, Mr. Walter. It also sells legislation. The Penal Servitude Act requires a monster to justify its chains. If the monster does not exist, they will paint one upon the wall." He undid the oilcloth, peeling back the layers to reveal the ledgers. The pages were crisp, the columns of numbers written in a hand that Thorne knew as well as his own. He opened the book to July, running his finger down the column of recorded assaults. "Look," Thorne said, urging a comparison to your own morgue and to what you printed yesterday. Walter leaned forward, the light from the desk lamp catching the deep lines around his mouth. He scanned the page, his finger tracing the dates. He turned the page, then another. The silence in the room stretched, filled only by the distant, muffled thrum of the presses downstairs. "These numbers," Walter said softly, noting that they are lower, significantly lower. "They are accurate," Thorne corrected. "The spike in your reports is a fabrication, a selection of the worst incidents, repeated across every sheet in London until the public believes the whole city is bleeding. Pilkington knew he was going to speak against the act based on these very figures. "Pilkington is dead," Walter said, looking up. His gaze was steady, unreadable. "And you are a clerk, a senior clerk, yes, but a clerk nonetheless. Why bring this to me? Why not to Sir George Lewis, to the Prime Minister?" "Because Lewis signed the inflated returns," Thorne said. The words tasted like ash. "And the Prime Minister needs the panic to pass the bill. I am not bringing this to a statesman, Mr. Walter. I am bringing it to a printer." Walter sat back in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight. He took off his spectacles and placed them on the desk, rubbing the bridge of his nose. For a moment, he looked very old, the burden of the city pressing down on his shoulders. "If I print this," Walter said, his voice low, "I undermine the government and I undermine the police." He paused. "I undermine my own paper's coverage of the last month." "You undermine a lie," Thorne said. "I sell papers based on the fear of that lie," Walter countered. He tapped the ledger with a blunt finger. "Do you think the public wants the truth, Mr. Thorne? Do you think they want to be told that their terror is a product of bad arithmetic? They want the monster. They want to know the government is protecting them from the abyss. If I tell them the abyss is empty, they will not thank me. They will think me a fool or a traitor." "Then let them think it," Thorne said. He felt a desperation rising in his throat, a need to make this man see. Men are going to the hulks. Innocent men. The ticket-of-leave system will be crushed, and with it, any hope of reform, all for a story that isn't true. Walter stood up and walked to the window. He looked out into the night, where the fog pressed against the glass, obscuring the world beyond. "You ask me to commit suicide," Walter said without turning. "The Times leads the chorus. If I change the tune now, the others will tear me apart. They will say I am soft on crime, that I am in the pocket of the criminals." "I ask you to print the numbers," Thorne said, insisting on just the numbers so that the readers might decide for themselves. Walter turned slowly. His face was set, the moment of vulnerability gone, replaced by the mask of the editor. "The numbers do not decide anything," Walter said. "Perception decides, and the perception is that London is burning." He walked back to the desk and closed the ledger with a definitive snap. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the small room. "I cannot print this, Mr. Thorne, not yet." "Not yet," the floor dropped away beneath Thorne. When the act is passed, or when the first innocent man is shipped to Gibraltar." "When the hysteria breaks naturally," Walter said. "It always does. The public tire of their monsters eventually. Then perhaps we can revisit the arithmetic. But now the tide is too strong." He pushed the ledger back across the desk towards Thorne. The gesture was final, a dismissal wrapped in politeness. "Take your truth," Walter said, urging that it be kept safe since it might prove useful when the weather changes. Thorne stared at the book, then at the man who controlled the voice of the nation. He saw the calculation in Walter's eyes, the cold weighing of risk against reward, of morality against circulation. There was no shame there, only business. "You are part of it," Thorne whispered. "You are as guilty as the men who forged the stats." "Perhaps," Walter said, sitting down and picking up his pen, "but I am the one who will be here when the fog lifts. Will you?" Thorne grabbed the ledger, shoving it back into the oilcloth. His hands shook so violently he could barely tie the string. He turned and walked to the door, the weight of the failure settling on his shoulders like a physical cloak. "Mr. Thorne," Walter called out just as his hand touched the latch. Thorne paused, not turning. "Be careful going down," Walter said, warning that the stairs are steep and the street outside is not as empty as it seems. Thorne opened the door and stepped out onto the gallery. The heat hit him again, suffocating and thick. Below, the presses continued their relentless rhythm, churning out the morning's lies by the thousand. He clutched the logs to his chest, feeling the hard edges dig into his palms. He had come to stop the machine, and instead, he had merely oiled its gears. He began the descent, his footsteps silent on the iron grating. As he reached the ground floor, the porter appeared from the shadows, watching him with an expression that might have been pity or perhaps just boredom. "Leaving so soon?" the porter asked. "The editor is busy," Thorne said, his voice hollow. "Aye," the porter said, moving to open the side door. "Always busy when the truth comes knocking." Thorne stepped out into the night. The fog had thickened, swallowing the square, reducing the world to a circle of grey light around his feet. He stood for a moment, disoriented, the cold dampness seeping through his boots. Then he remembered the cigar. He scanned the darkness, his heart hammering against his ribs. Across the square, beneath the flickering gas lamp, the figure was still there. The glow of the cigar burned bright in the gloom, a single unblinking eye watching him. The man pushed himself off the wall and began to walk, not towards Thorne, but parallel to him, matching his pace along the opposite pavement. Thorne tightened his grip on the oilcloth bundle. He had no cab, he had no allies, and he had the truth, which in this city at this hour was the most dangerous thing a man could carry. He turned his collar up against the damp and began to walk, the sound of the stranger's footsteps echoing softly in the mist, keeping time with his own. The scrape of a heel on wet stone marked the distance between them. Thorne kept to the edge of the pavement, his shoulder brushing the rough brick of the warehouse walls, while the fog coiled around his legs like a living thing that sought to drag him down. He did not look back. To look back would be to acknowledge the hunter, and he refused to grant the shadow that dignity. Instead, he focused on the bundle under his arm, the oilcloth slick with condensation, the hard corners of the ledger digging into his bicep with every step. The weight of it felt excessive, as though the paper inside had swollen with the damp air, gaining mass until it threatened to pull him off balance. A hansom cab lurched out of the mist ahead, the horse blowing steam from its nostrils in rhythmic puffs that vanished into the grey. Thorne raised a hand. The driver pulled the reins, the wheels groaning as they halted on the cobbles. "Where to?" the driver asked. His voice was rough, scraped raw by years of inhaling coal smoke. "Russell Square," Thorne said. He stepped forward, reaching for the door latch. The driver did not move to open it. He stayed perched on the high seat, looking down at Thorne with eyes that reflected the dim glow of the street lamp. "Full up," the driver said. Thorne paused, his hand hovering inches from the leather strap. The cab was empty. He could see the vacant seat through the open window, the velvet worn smooth in the center. "I see no one inside." "Full up," the driver repeated. He flicked the reins. The horse stepped forward, forcing Thorne to stumble back onto the pavement to avoid the wheel. "Best walk, governor, safer on your feet tonight." The cab moved off, disappearing into the void almost immediately, the sound of the wheels muffled by the thick air. Thorne stood alone in the sudden quiet, the rejection settling in his stomach like a stone. It was not a refusal of fare. It was a warning. The driver had seen the man behind him, or perhaps the driver knew better than to carry a passenger who was being hunted. He resumed walking. His breath came in short, sharp bursts that chilled his throat, but he forced his pace to remain steady, neither hastening nor slowing, for panic was a scent that dogs and men could both detect. The street narrowed here, the buildings leaning in towards one another as if whispering secrets across the gap, their windows dark and shuttered against the night. He could smell the river now, a heavy, cloying stench of mud and rotting timber that rose to meet him as he approached Blackfriars. Behind him, the rhythm of the footsteps changed. No longer a casual stroll, the sound became purposeful, a steady cadence that matched his own stride for stride. Thorne tightened his grip on the oilcloth. His fingers' numbness was spreading from the tips inward, a cold paralysis that made the bundle feel slippery in his grasp. He needed to turn. He needed to see the face. But the instinct for self-preservation, that ancient cowardice that had kept him safe in the corridors of Whitehall for 10 years, held his head fixed forward. He turned left into a narrow alleyway that ran between the back of a printing house and a chandler's shop. The darkness here was absolute, the fog denser, swallowing the light from the main road. He pressed himself against the damp wall, listening. The footsteps continued past the entrance of the alley, then stopped. Silence stretched out, thick and suffocating, broken only by the drip of water from a leaking gutter overhead. Thorne waited. His chest tightened, the air feeling too thin to sustain him. "Mr. Thorne." The voice came from the shadows behind him, not ahead. He spun around, his back scraping against the brickwork. The man with the cigar stepped out from the recess of a doorway, the glow of the tobacco illuminating the lower half of his face. He wore a heavy coat with a velvet collar, and his gloves were black leather, immaculate despite the grime of the street. "You walk fast for a clerk," the man said. He took a drag from the cigar, the ember flaring bright in the gloom. "Who are you?" Thorne's voice sounded thin, stripped of the authority he wielded over the junior staff in the record room. "An observer." The man exhaled a plume of smoke that mingled with the fog. "Mr. Walters suggested you might need an escort. The streets are dangerous for men carrying secrets." "I require no escort." "We all require something." Pushing himself off the wall, the man closed the distance between them without rushing, moving instead with the confidence of one who knows the prey has nowhere to run. "The ledger, Mr. Thorne, it is heavy." He offered a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Let me relieve you of the burden." "It belongs to the Home Office." "Does it?" The man tilted his head. "I understood it was private correspondence. Mr. Pilkington's letters, surely they belong to the family, or perhaps to the press, if the public interest is served." Thorne shifted the bundle behind his back. The brickwork bit into his spine. "The public interest is served by the truth," Thorne said. "The truth is a variable." The man stopped 3 feet away. The smell of the cigar was overpowering now, masking the scent of the river. "It changes depending on who holds the pen. You are a clerk. You copy. You do not create. Give it to me." Thorne looked at the man's hands, steady and large, capable of violence. He thought of Walter's warning about the stairs, then of the driver who refused the fare. They were not just watching him, they were herding him away from the main roads, away from the constables, into the dark. "No," Thorne said. The man sighed. It was a sound of genuine disappointment, as if a child had refused a sweet. "Pity," the man said. He dropped the cigar onto the wet ground and crushed it under his heel. "I hoped we could be civil." He lunged. Thorne did not think. He threw the bundle. It was not a calculated move, but a spasm of desperation. The oilcloth packet flew past the man's head, landing with a wet slap in the mud of the gutter. The man flinched, his eyes darting to the prize for a fraction of a second. That was all Thorne needed. He shoved past the man, his shoulder colliding with the hard muscle of the stranger's chest, and ran. He did not run towards the main road. He ran deeper into the alley, towards the sound of rushing water. The Thames was there, invisible but audible, lapping against the embankment. He could hear the man swearing behind him, the sound of boots scrambling on the slick stones. Thorne's lungs burned. His feet slipped on the cobbles. He reached the end of the alley and found himself facing the high wall of the embankment. There was no way out, no gate, only the river below and the wall above. He spun around. The man was emerging from the fog, a knife now in his hand, the blade catching the faint light. "End of the line," the man said. Thorne backed up until his heels touched the edge of the drop, where the water churned blackly below, inches from his boots. He looked at the knife, then at the man's eyes, and realized with a cold clarity that there would be no negotiation. The ledger was not just evidence, it was a death warrant for Pilkington, and now for him. He reached into his coat pocket. "Something for you," Thorne said. He pulled out his handkerchief, white linen, spotless. He held it out. The man hesitated, confused by the gesture. Thorne dropped the handkerchief. As the man's eyes followed the white cloth down, Thorne kicked out, not at the man, but at the loose stones piled near the wall. They skittered into the river with a splash. The man looked down at the water. Thorne vaulted. He did not jump into the river. He jumped sideways, into the shadow of a coal barge moored against the wall, grabbing the rusted iron rung of a ladder that hung just above the waterline. His feet dangled over the black tide. The man rushed to the edge, looking down, but the fog had already swallowed Thorne whole. He climbed down into the dark, towards the smell of coal dust and stagnant water. He had lost the ledger, but he had kept his life. And he knew now with absolute certainty that Whitehall was not the enemy, it was the graveyard. He needed a place where the ink did not dry. He needed the printing plates. The Chokehold of the Penny Press is a work of fiction. Its characters and scenes are invented, but the story is grounded in real events, places, and the social conditions of its period, dramatized, not documented. The history behind it draws on these real sources. London garrotting panics. List of moral panics. Researched via Wikipedia and contemporary records. Liberties taken with the timeline or with real persons are the author's own.